pleasure to here to host the event and to introduce my good old friend, Ian Rowen. So how many years have we known each other? 10, more than 10, because we knew each other since we were all graduate students, right? Yeah, so Ian, good old friend, and I'm so happy he can come to Taiwan to be a colleague here to work in师大National Taiwan Normal University. So Ian now is an associate professor in the Department of Taiwan Culture, Languages, and Literature at National Taiwan Normal University. And he previously served as assistant professor at another NTU, okay? The assistant professor of sociology, geography, and urban planning at Nanyang Technical University in Singapore. So before earning his PhD in geography from the University of Colorado at Boulder in 2016, Ian worked as a translator, journalist, musician, tour guide, hotelier, and entrepreneur. Why bother being a geographer right now? All right, so his life experience is so exciting, and another exciting thing is that Ian is really fluent in Mandarin Chinese. Of course, today's talk is in English, but at the same time, Ian is also proficient in Bahasa Indonesia, right? Proficient. Okay. How about Taiwanese? 没要讲, okay. Okay, so at the same time, he's the editor of Transitions in Taiwan, Stories of the White-tailed Bicycle, published by Cambria Press at the year of 2021, and served as the lead translator of Tibetan environmentalists in China, published in Rowen Lithosphere in the year of 2015. So Ian's previous translations credits include such award-winning films such as The Splendid Plot and Spider Lilies, right? Directed by Zero Zhou. Wow, you have done multiple things. Yeah. So much of his early scholarly work focused on the cultural and political geography of both travel and broadcast between PRC, People's Republic of China, and Taiwan. So treating tourism as a political technology, he pays particular attention to performances of state territory and ethno-national membership. And I believe today's story is about that, right? And his newer work examines the politics of emerging historical periodization schemes, such as the World Economic Forum's the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the hybrid spaces of globalizing cultural movements such as the Burning Man. Okay, and his work, he is productive too. His academic work is published in the leading journals in geography and area studies, and also at the same time you can also see Ian's work at the New York Times, the BBC, Chinese, and the Guardian and elsewhere. So his research has also been supported with the Fulbright Fellowship and multiple U.S. National Science Foundation grants. He has delivered invited talk at many institutions: Stanford, Harvard, Berkeley, and the SOAS in London, NYU. And so today he's here at National Taiwan University right now. Ian is here to give us a talk about his very new book, One China, Many Taiwans, The Geopolitics of Cross-Strait Tourism, published by Cornell University. So let's welcome Ian Rowen.
Thanks so much, Boyi, for that incredibly enthusiastic introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here presenting at Taida. I have spoken about this book to your class. I gave a talk in Mandarin a few years ago, an earlier version of this, and also to Huang Shumei, now teaching in Shanxiangsuo. And I think that was at Beijing, right, when I spoke about this?
Wow, it's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. Yeah. The project's come a long way since then, and the book is so new that I don't have a copy. I'm incredibly embarrassed and ashamed, but I do hear that they exist. I have seen photos of my book. on Facebook, so I do know they're out there in the world. Cornell University Press will hopefully ship my 15 copies to me one of these days, and then I'll be able to wave it and flog it and use it as a doorstop and everything else. I'd like, before I start talking a bit more from the book, assuming my lecturing thing here works, thank you. To note, this project, like pretty much all of my research, began with personal experience. As Boyi noted, I have worked as a tour guide. In 2006, I took mostly Americans, Europeans, and some Latin Americans around China. We started in Beijing, we went to Xi'an, to Bingmayong, we went to Guilin, to various other places, and I realized as I was touring all of these people, in 2006, kind of a pivotal time. It was a very different time in the US-China relationship, a very different, China had a kind of a different place in the world, discourse. And I realized as I was touring these people that I was in many ways framing their experience of China. I was translating not just language, but the place. In fact, I was translating China as a territory. And this had real-world effects, because some of my guests were policymakers, some were scholars, and some were business people deciding where to invest. I realized that tourism, you know, I've been a tourist much of my life. I presume a lot of us have traveled places. It seems fun and games and leisure, but actually it has very real geopolitical and geoeconomic effects. And so when I decided to embark on my graduate study in geography, it seemed like this would be interesting based on that personal experience, but also really a profound way to think through the China and Taiwan relationship. Because at that time, Chinese tourists had first just started coming here in very large numbers. And it wasn't obvious how things would go. And I'm really glad I did this research when I did, because it's not possible to do this research anymore, as I'll talk about in the book and in the presentation today. So the way this will work, I'm going to read from the first few pages of the introduction to give a sense of the tone, the style, and the stakes of the book. There'll be some, of course, some visual aids, some photos to illustrate, and then I'll go through each chapter briefly and give you a taste of what that's like. And then I really welcome some conversation, some comments afterwards. So in 2008, as the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, pointed thousands of missiles towards Taiwan, it started sending millions of tourists the same way. The tourists were welcomed not only by a travel industry eager for new sources of revenue, but by President Ma Ying-jeou, who was elected earlier that year. President Ma claimed that the opening would strengthen the economy and improve Taiwan's relations with what he called mainland China. The tourists, said Ma's administration, might return home with a positive impression of Taiwan's democracy, which would lead to mutual understanding and maybe even political reconciliation. But still, despite the growing flow of leisure travelers and the social, economic, and political connections that they facilitated, citizens and officials on both sides of the Taiwan Strait didn't quite agree on the cultural character or spatial definition of the territories they were traveling between. It turned out that tourism deepened the difference. As far as most Chinese tourists were concerned, they were traveling in a part of China, culturally familiar, if undeniably distinct politically. Indeed, Taiwan, an archipelago of 23 million people, the western shore of the main island, 150 kilometers away across a heavily militarized strait, was listed as a province on all the PRC maps and passports. And of course, you can see Taiwan with the whole South China Sea and that 9-dash line on a standard map of China. As far as Chinese authorities were concerned, the ultimate goal of all cross-strait policy, including tourism, was political control and ultimately annexation, euphemistically referred to as unification and defined as a national core interest. Some China-friendly leaders in Taiwan also hoped for territorial unification, even if they had a different vision of what that future China would look like and how it would be governed. However, many people in Taiwan had a different idea entirely. That these mainland guests, or Lu Ke, as they called them, were entering a different country, where they were welcome to spend their money, have a good time, mind their own business, and then go home. For those concerned about PRC irredentism, tourism looked like another one of several weapons aimed at Taiwan's sovereignty. As it happened, at the same time that Cross-Strait tourism accelerated, so did Taiwanese national identification and pro-independence sentiment, leading to unprecedented protests and electoral shifts against PRC-friendly politicians. The potential for tension should have been clear, for 2008 was not the first time that Taiwan had received a rapid influx of arrivals from China. 60-odd years earlier, at the close of World War II, Taiwan was overwhelmed by weary and desperate soldiers serving the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, who were then retreating from the military advance of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. These soldiers and the KMT-dominated state apparatus that they propped up, the Republic of China, or ROC, occupied Taiwan in 1945 with the support of the US after Imperial Japan was forced to end its half-century of colonization. Many Taiwanese saw the military men as uncouth and unhygienic, qualities not so dissimilar from those later attributed to 21st century tourists. But unlike today's visitors, these soldiers had nowhere to return to after the CCP consolidated its control and established the PRC in Beijing. They instead were pressed to enforce the oppressive and often murderous rule of the émigré ROC in Taiwan, and sometimes also suffered violence themselves under the authoritarian regime. Even after the lifting of martial law in 1987, Taiwanese have continued to live under the ever-present threat of the new Chinese military invasion, this time from the PRC, whose leaders have pledged to eventually reunify Taiwan by any means necessary. Subtly written into the practice of tourism then, amidst the rhetoric of reconciliation, was the recapitulation of a past military occupation and the foreshadowing of a future assault. Such semiotic excess evokes Jacques Derrida's meditation on the etymological entwinement and transmutable tension between hospitality and hostility, in which he suggests that, quote, for the invited guest, as much as for the visitor, the crossing of the threshold always remains a transgressive step. Taiwan's thresholds are tense, tangled, and constructed through a series of transgressions. Here, tourism animates guests, hosts, and guides in a turbulent dance of difference and identity, making plain that tourism is no mere leisure activity. Rather, it is staged for struggle over ethnic identity and national borders, a geopolitical instrument and event that performs and can potentially transform state territory. Tourism, I will demonstrate, has been one of several strategies aimed at achieving the political control of Taiwan for the PRC. But how has it worked in practice? And what does this case have to say to the many tourism scholars and industry and political leaders that tourism can promote peace and understanding? This book argues that contrary to the PRC's efforts to incorporate Taiwan as part of an undivided one China, tourism actually aggravated tensions between the two polities, polarized Taiwanese society, and pushed national sentiment farther for support for national self-determination. In the process, Taiwan's staging of state sovereignty bifurcated into what could be described as two Taiwans. The Taiwan performed as a part of China for group tourists, versus the Taiwan experienced as a site of everyday life by local residents and some independent tourists. This split corresponded with a growing fissure of domestic political economy, amplifying the conflict between those business, civil society, and state actors that had an interest in sustaining the PRC-oriented tourist industry versus those who did not. These tourism-inflected two Taiwans are among the most vivid manifestations of inconsistent nationalisms spanning a territory that was already realizing a distinct and distinctly inclusive subjectivity. Indeed, Taiwan's identity is increasingly predicated on a pluralistic civic nationalism in which not just one or two, but many Taiwans coexist, more or less comfortably, even as it is existentially threatened. Although the transformations of Taiwan and China are the focus of this book, attention to their unusual features can illustrate the role of everyday practices, such as the use of national flags, maps, names, and travel permits, in the conduct of tourism and the production of political spaces elsewhere. Indeed, looking at everyday practices of state administration and interpersonal encounter in contested states sheds light on the peculiarity of normative sovereignties more generally. Likewise, looking at exceptional and even world-shattering moments can shed light on peculiar practices long taken for granted. By traveling along these spatial and temporal edges of sovereignty, one can witness the instability of the center. In this case, the notion of exclusive state territory, an elusive yet persistent phantasm that haunts the gaps and fissures of the world system. Its incomplete suture to international representative bodies like the UN, rupturing violently into view through the COVID-19 pandemic, which imploded global mobility and illuminated the geopolitical stakes of tourism. When I began this project, scholarship on cross-strait tourism usually assumed an affect and effect of reconciliation and rapprochement. This is symptomatic of much of tourism studies' assumptions about peace and borders, which usually elide the unpleasantries of politics. The typical treatment, and these are a few of the earlier articles that I had to contend with, usual treatment is one in which Taiwan and mainland China are partitioned states expected to reconcile and even unify, in part through the promotion of cross-strait tourism. As for the Chinese language scholarship, most accounts from both sides of the strait also assume the telos of reconciliation and focus largely on economic impacts or destination marketing. My book speaks back to this body of scholarship and aims to open up new trajectories for tourism studies and the social sciences more broadly. What's been missing in these studies, apart from a more critical discussion of Taiwan's territoriality, is an appreciation that tourism doesn't necessarily promote reconciliation or understanding, but can actually serve opposing interests and produce unpredictable effects. This seemed clear enough to me, having worked in the industry alongside Chinese and Taiwanese people, both as a tour guide but also as a hotelier in China in a Taiwanese-owned hotel with Chinese staff, and seeing how often staff, management, guests misunderstood each other even when speaking what seemed to be more or less the same language, and even when people thought they were more or less from the same culture, society, or country. This image is from 2013, I think, when I was conducting field work at Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall, spending weeks and weeks and weeks watching tourists come and go, chatting them up, talking to them, interviewing them, and so on. And I heard one of them announce this. "This is all just for show." They shouted this during the routine changing of the guards at Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall, here in Taipei. And I observed this tourist complain loudly to whoever would listen before he stormed outside. He wasn't wrong. Of course, the military guards wearing starched uniforms and marching with bayonets in these precisely timed drills were giving a show. The monument, with its grandiose, if now slightly dilapidated facade and gigantic statue of Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the ROC, was designed for show. And likewise, the tourists' very loud public dismissal was a kind of show. But this blatant theatricality makes this phenomena no less powerful or productive. In fact, this kind of phenomena is powerful and productive precisely because it is a performance. The performance with both the soldiers and the tourists, like the tourist's prior encounter with the border guard on his arrival to Taiwan and his application for a travel permit to enter Taiwan in the first place, produced the tourist and the toured, the guest and the host, as national subjects. In so doing, it produced, reproduced, and troubled the state and interstate system. The unsettling and uncanny aspects of such stasis and practices points not only to the fragility of contested states, but also to the general instability of states and state subjects, which require constant work to maintain. Although cross-strait tourism may seem in many ways to be an extraordinary case, contoured as it is by clashing territorial claims, it's precisely its extraordinariness that makes it valuable for building theory about the geopolitics of tourism in general. So much is taken for granted in the scholarship and practice of tourism that the study of an extraordinary situation may uncover what, through repetition, has come to seem ordinary, a world split into nation states with mutually exclusive territories, a global mobility regime of visas and passports, of embassies and border guards, and so on, but which is in fact an unlikely and unstable configuration of spaces, bodies, and practices. Pandemic punctuations aside, millions of tourists cross borders every year. Passports in hand, these tourists act as the citizen subjects of the various nation-states of the world. They travel for any number of reasons. When they cross borders from their own country into another and then return home, they not only carry memories and souvenirs, they, along with border agents and airlines, travel agents and tour operators, are performing, effectively enacting, and potentially transforming the borders that they are crossing and the territories they are traversing. The central conceptual proposition of this book is that tourism performs and can transform state territory. This argument is informed by Michel Foucault's analytics of government, which attends to points of, quote, contact between the technologies of domination of others and those of the self. These social and political technologies produce temporarily durable, but never finished subjects and objects. Seen in this way, states and citizens are not a priori political agents, and territories are not passive spatial containers, but rather are effects of power-laden relationships, always already in a state of flux, of becoming, of change, contradiction, of rupture, and reformation. To put the point concisely, tourism can and should be theorized as a technology of state territorialization. What does it mean to perform state territory, and how might tourism transform it? Well, let's begin with territory, which is better conceived as an act or practice rather than an object or place. I treat territory as a political practice and pattern of relations that names, claims, calculates, and bounds space. More specifically, I use state territorialization to refer to the particular practices by which space is rendered or configured as belonging to and bounded by a collective actor imagined as a particular state, in whose name individuals are interpolated as citizens or subjects, aliens or foreigners, and which is imagined as the source of central political authority for a national territory, as put by Joe Hager. However, this collective actor is imagined, the practices, mechanisms, and institutions through which processes of interpolation take place are very real and often violent. Territories acquire spatial definition through the production and reproduction of borders, which establish constitutive divisions between what is inside and what is outside. These borders are not simply lines on a map, but social and discursive practices that take place in time. To name the processes by which people become attached to particular state or national territories, I take the term territorial socialization from the political geographer David Newman, who has observed that places just outside effective administrative borders, but still within other imagined boundaries, often become cast as crucial to the integrity of a territorial unit, amplifying potential for physical and symbolic conflict. So, if territoriality pivots on the constitutive distinction between inside and outside, tourism theory pivots on the distinction between guest and host. Early works in tourism theory tend to treat the guest as a typical or even the quintessential modern subject in search of a sense of authenticity and difference from home. Although these works provide useful reference points for this case, their empirical basis in Euro-American leisure tourism limits their scope and theoretical purchase. Later waves of tourism research by Asian and Asia-focused scholars, inspired in part by post-colonial and post-structural theory, both built on and pushed back against these conceptual foundations to argue that tourism elsewhere can operate and therefore needs to be theorized in radically different ways. Unlike the idealized Western tourist in search of the exotic, many Chinese travelers, it turns out, are not necessarily interested in pursuing an experience of cultural authenticity or difference. In many cases, it's actually a space of identification and familiarity that is desired by visitors and produced by the tourism industries and state agencies that cater to them. These theoretically sophisticated studies are as important for what they can anticipate about Chinese tourism to Taiwan as for what they can't account for. The peculiar Cross-Strait case in which Han Chinese guests identify with Taiwanese hosts as fellow ethno-national subjects, albeit under a distinct political regime they are themselves implicated in transforming, yet with limited recognition that their sense of ethno-national fellowship is seldom shared by their hosts. In Taiwan, such tricky gaps between spaces and senses of identity and difference are mediated through the personage of the guide, a professional specialist who interprets for and translates between guests and hosts. As I described in Chapter 4's ethnography of a Chinese group tour, the translational work of guides, whether fulfilled with faithful or fraudulent intent, is not mimetic, but creative and productive. Through their skillful sequencing and staging, tour guides, together with their manifold props and supporting actors, not only smoothen social difference, but also actively reassemble the worlds they translate between. I coined this term territorial translation to describe this in more vivid detail in the chronology of the group tour. So, with those theoretical preliminaries out of the way, I'd like to just tour us through the chapters and get us back to some pretty pictures. Chapter 1 provides a history of Taiwan's exceptional territoriality. And this, unfortunately, I'm sure anyone in the room who's attempted to publish in journals or publish books about Taiwan is often asked to spend hundreds, if not thousands of words providing a very basic understanding of what Taiwan is, who's here, and so on and so forth. These sorts of things that, I don't know, Americans don't have to be writing for American journals, but everyone has to be writing about Taiwan. This book is no exception, yet it does it by structuring the chapter around travel and tourism and mobility. And it begins with this very common tale of Taiwanese students and scholars frustrated to be denied entry to the United Nations public spaces in Geneva because they don't have a passport from a member country. And it uses this to give an account of Taiwan's exceptional territoriality as a legacy of multiple waves of colonization, democratization, and diplomatic crises. It depicts Taiwan's contemporary blue-green partisan divide, as well as its odd international representation, and attempts to make sense of bewildering confections like the so-called status quo, which is anything but static, and Chinese Taipei, Zhonghua Taipei, which I just saw on the TV news last night. There's something up with the baseball team, right? Zhonghua is having issues. But by taking this nice tweet from the New York Times stringer Chris Horton, why reporting on Taiwan isn't easy in one photo. Taiwanese audience in Republic of China Afro-Wigs cheers the arrival of Team Chinese Taipei. So, this is at the Summer Universiade in 2017, and I translate this into analytic terms as follows. A people with a consolidated national identity are administered by a dislocated state apparatus that anachronistically shares the territorial reference of the iridescent power that replaced it. Symbolically figured by a nationality, Chinese, to which only a dwindling minority subscribes, and imagined to live in a city, Taipei, not inhabited by a majority of the island's residents. The so-called status quo is a strange kind of status indeed. And this all sets the stage for Chapter 2, which provides a history of mobility, or the lack thereof, between Taiwan and China. First during the Cold War and martial law eras, and then following the 1987-1988 opening of limited travel in both directions. It describes how the Chen Shui-bian administration actually attempted to open up to Chinese tourists, but was thwarted by a PRC that collaborated with the KMT to bring the latter back to power under a different leadership and nationalist ideology under the catchphrase of the 92 Consensus. So Chapter 2 begins with the 92 Consensus, quote, one China, each with its own interpretation, which performatively constituted a so-called consensus, and was the rhetorical basis for China and Taiwan political relations, including the regulation and facilitation of tourism during the 2008-16 presidency of KMT leader Ma Ying-jeou. A diplomatic fiction, it referred to the apocryphal outcome of a series of meetings between quasi-official PRC and ROC agencies on Taiwan representatives in 1992. And sorry to repeat this history, some may be familiar and some less so. These meetings did not actually result in any jointly written statements, but ROC representatives, all of whom belong to the KMT, later claimed that they had agreed with their counterparts that both sides of the Taiwan Strait belonged to one country called China, with each side allowed a different interpretation of what that China is. For its part, the PRC never acknowledged the each with its own interpretation clause, even if it was frequently cited by KMT leaders. If the Ma administration's steadfast invocation of the 92 consensus temporarily maintained the actually exceptional status quo of Taiwan's de facto independence, it also fueled popular suspicion that forces on both sides of the strait plan to use state and market mechanisms to enact unification with or annexation by the PRC. And the 2008 opening of direct flights and an explosion in tourism in terms of both capital investment and human traffic were among the most visible outcomes of cross-strait political cooperation, or conniving, depending on one's point of view. Indeed, by 2010, Chinese tourists surpassed Japanese to become the top inbound tourism segment in Taiwan, and made a lot of money for some people, although those revenues weren't widely shared, as I discuss in some detail in this chapter. Also in this chapter, I talk about the very unusual permits that were used, not passports and visas, but entry-exit permits and mobility permits, which got around this question of a territorial dispute by avoiding talk about being a country or not. Chapter 3 tours the reader around Taiwan, and it goes from the National Palace Museum to the Shili Night Market to Taidong's Dulan, treating Taiwan's national iconography as a field of paradoxes for both residents and tourists. When Chinese tourists arrive, whatever their feelings and education about Taiwan's sovereignty, they're immediately confronted with the official regalia of the ROC, a state the Chinese government holds to be illegitimate. And as they travel the island, they encounter emanations not only of the ROC, but also of manifest differences in political and cultural expression between Taiwan and China. And just one light example, I took this photo in the Songshan airport, and you see here that Chinese destinations like Chengdu, Shanghai, Hongqiao are represented as international. This couldn't be done in China, where Taiwan is placed in Gang Altai, like it's international and Gang Altai, which I have an article coming out about in a few months. The invention of Gang Altai is a discursive fabrication. Yet, all of this produces a sense of exceptional and even multiple and overlapping sovereignties, which is compounded further when Taiwanese independence activists dispute the legitimacy of both China's and the ROC's claims to Taiwan. But even while immersed in distinctive ROC or Taiwanese symbolism that dots the landscape, many Chinese visitors proved able to overlook markers of difference and insist in interviews that Taiwan is obviously a part of China. And this effect is possible in part due to direct and conscious performances by industry actors themselves. Incentivized by profits and sometimes by political favors, a sufficient subset of the Taiwanese public and private sector mobilized to produce a sufficiently consistent sense of being in China for tourists traveling within the liminal spaces of Taiwan. And this production was especially effective for group tourists, who usually said that they felt as if they were still in their home country. And not just because of official claims, but because saving industry actors here shaped, narrated, and translated their experiences in ways that made it seem more familiar than it might be otherwise. The simultaneous overlap and disjuncture between the Taiwan of its residents and the Taiwan of its Chinese tourists finds an evocative analogy in this wonderful book by Chen Nievel, The City and the City. Anyone here read this? Great. So this book tells the tale of two city-states, Beshel and Molkoma, that belong to different nations and juridical realms, but in fact interlaced throughout the same physical space. The space is divided into total or alter, either one or the other, or crosshatch areas where the cities converge to share roads, train lines, and buildings. On the edges in between the cities, and even on different floors of the same buildings, the citizens of each city have trained themselves to see and sense what is domestic, and unsee and unsense what is foreign. Yet car crashes, gas explosions, mentally ill attackers, and other border-perforating catastrophes can throw the careful unseeing into sudden disarray, provoking confusion or worse when citizens of either side are forced to see something unexpected or taboo about the other. Like these fantastical realms, the Taiwan lived in by its residents and the Taiwan fabricated for tourists are performed as two different nations that intersect and interlace within the same physical coordinates. The first Taiwan is simply Taiwan as a lived space, socially distinct and politically de facto independent, but largely due to Chinese pressure, diplomatically unrecognized by most of the world. The second Taiwan is an indivisible part of China, an irredentist fantasy land sketched by official PRC rhetoric, perceived by a dwindling number of ROC partisans, and performed by complicit parts of the Taiwanese tourist industry. That these two Taiwans are the same Taiwan is a social surreality that its residents are remarkably adept at living with. While the effective salience of the ROC state apparatus retreated in the face of a rising Taiwanese nationalism, the transformations of tourism simultaneously and desensitized particular travel routes. Even some Chinese tourists, particularly those who crossed beyond the prescribed circuits of the group tour, understood the vagaries and ironies of what could be called, following Nievo, total alter, exclusively Taiwanese or Chinese, and crosshatch, both Taiwanese and Chinese spaces. And indeed, some tourist circuits overlapped with residential spaces and others did not. Some sites, like the National Palace Museum, Gugong, or the beach area of Kending, became so crowded as to provoke resentment from locals and dissuade them from visiting. Others, including stores operated by the KMT itself and CD commission shopping so-called museums, were out of the way and easy enough for most Taiwanese to ignore. While Taiwan's contested relationship with China makes this process especially fraught, for tourists who were taught the hegemonic interpretation of Taiwan as a part of China, these familiar features simply prove a point that most rarely question. But these effects were quite uneven and manifested in contradictory ways, and were implemented with different sorts of linguistic and spatial strategies. And to make sense of this, I borrow from Foucault's concept of heterotopia, a term for a space that is in relation with all other sites, but in a way, and I'm quoting here, in such a way as to suspect, neutralize, or invert the set of relations that they happen to designate, mirror, or reflect. And I'm not the first to point out Taiwan as kind of a heterotopic political space. Francois mentioned, whose name I'm sure I'm butchering, wrote a paper about Taiwan as a political heterotopia that is quite useful. I used heterotopia here not so much to describe Taiwan, but as kind of an analytic method to tour the reader around Taiwan. So I go to Gugong, I go to Kending, I go to Dulan, I take you, the reader, there, and talk about what seems more Taiwanese, more Chinese, how these ideas are subverting each other all the time, and how tourism has transformed those and made them even more confusing in many ways. Probably most spectacularly at Taipei 101. This photo I took in 2014 of Falun Gong, the religious group banned in China, demonstrating for Chinese tourists to see. A group of pro-PRC but Taiwan-based demonstrators, the so-called Aiguo Tongxin Hui, the concentric patriotic association, something, demonstrating against Falun Gong. And then out of the picture also arrived the Taiwan Independence Revolutionary Army, playing songs in Taiyu and advocating for Taiwan independence. These people were all in the same place, making a cacophony that was impossible even for Taiwanese people to parse. It was as if there were multiple countries, territories, identities, ethnicities, all clashing in one space on behalf of tourists. And it's such an iconic site as well. You know, Taipei 101 being kind of the exemplar of Taiwanese modernity circa 2002. So I put this image on the cover of the book to demonstrate really what's at stake, although as a courtesy to them, even though they're posing, I think I blur their faces. So this all sets the stage for the centerpiece and what one reviewer has called the tour de force of the book, which is my nearly diaristic and often very painful account of circling Taiwan with a tour group from Shanghai and surrounds. I don't recommend this, don't do this at home. But I spent the summer of 2014, after the Sunflower Movement, in Shanghai, doing research on how Chinese tourists prepare to come to Taiwan. In so doing, I walked into a bunch of travel agencies trying to find one that would take me as a Chinese tourist on one of these tours. I begin chapter 4. Well, here we have some buses, and of course Falun Gong is here demonstrating against them. I begin this chapter, which is, it's painfully personal, with this quote from the tour guide. 上车睡觉，下车尿尿，回家什么都不知道。Get on the coach and sleep. Get off the coach and pee. Go home knowing nothing. Saying the guide to me toward the end of our trip in August 2014. A typical low to mid-budget package tour priced at about US $900 and including a round-trip airfare from Shanghai to Taiwan, hotel accommodation, most meals, and mandatory shopping trips. I had chosen to join this trip precisely for its banal, unexceptional, mass-market qualities. And after 8 days of touristic tedium, the guide's deprecating ditty rang true enough. But after getting on and off the bus countless times, I've learned that this trip's medium and its tedium was its message. The tour's design and conduct, even or especially at its most banal and repetitive, had a very straightforward territorial effect. It was structured just like any group tour in China, but transposed to Taiwan. But there were some very peculiar features, like we were taken, for example, to a jade shop in Hualien, run by the KMT itself, and that we were told that the more outrageously priced jewelry we bought, the faster Taiwan and China would unify. And they used all kinds of very clever puns. So we should buy more vases, because ping sounds like vase, peace sounds like vase, we should buy vases, and we should also buy vases that were 1 meter and 92 centimeters high, one China, 92 consensus. And they pointed to photos of Taiwan politicians like Song Zhouyu, who I think he just said he might run for president at age 80 or something. Pictures of him giving vases like that to Hu Jintao. Pictures of former KMT leader and Vice President Lian Zhan doing the same. So this was really striking. We also, we were told we'd stay in Kending. They actually put us in Zhejiang. We were told we'd stay in Taitung, but we stayed in Taiwan, but we stayed in Chengdong. Like there are a lot of funny things wrong with the itinerary. We went to a so-called Deng Yijun, Teresa Tang museum in Kaohsiung that was basically it was just a cover for a store. Like they had some photos of some of her albums, like a mahjong set that she never played, and basically used that to sell us more and more and more stuff. Our tour guide was extraordinary. He was from Tainan, but he was a retired military officer, and he, throughout the tour, kept saying, he kept slagging off Japanese people using a lot of racial slurs as a way, he told me, to cater to the tourists. And a lot of the tourists seemed to appreciate this. He also said things like, because our premier Wen Jiabao, 咱们总理 Wen Jiabao, and he's saying our is in Taiwan and China, couldn't come to Taiwan to go to the places he wanted to go. In this case, it was Zhongtai Chansi, the Zhongtai Buddhist monastery, and I think Guangshan, which we also went to, we would go there on his behalf. So this tour guide was kind of hamming up his role, and this is why I refer to him really as a territorial translator. He was also changing his language. Instead of calling Taiwanese indigenous people 原住民, he would refer to them as 高山族, using a very outdated ethnic category that is still used in the PRC. Also adjusted, and this makes sense, and there's nothing nefarious about this, but instead of saying Guangdie for CB, he would say Guangpan and the like. Like he was very, very sophisticated about adjusting his language to mainland conventions. But really the very clever thing was he was very, very skilled about avoiding politically provocative positions. He almost never referred to Taiwan and China as separate polities. It was Taipei and Beijing, for example. So I observed a lot of other tour guides doing this, and not because they're following a script given to them by an agency or the state, but their own very skillful improvisation as a way basically to keep their jobs. It makes sense. So group 4 analyzes in great detail. We go around. I described staying with my roommate from Jiangsu, who I met on the plane. I'm happy to talk about this in Q&A, but I just recommend you read it. There's some mordantly funny things in this chapter. Chapter 5 is also a bit amusing. It begins by contrasting the accounts of Anhan, China's, at least then, most famous blogger, who posted a widely read piece about how great his trip to Taiwan was in 2012, because Taiwan, in his mind, had saved Chinese culture He loses some glasses. He loses his phone in a taxi. He's given some free glasses in a glasses store, and he writes about how Chinese people are so nice and so generous. He was worried, like, if this happened in China, he thought he'd about to get robbed or something. But because this is Taiwan, people here are so nice, and it's because Taiwan saved Chinese culture by not having a cultural revolution, and so on. So he uses Taiwan as this rose-tinted window for viewing China, and it really makes him think about what it means to be Chinese, not just Taiwanese. So I contrast this account with the account of a young art student who I met in Shanghai that summer before she came to Taiwan, and who texted me on WeChat throughout her trip about her exposure in Taiwan to forbidden knowledge. She went to a talk at Changping, at the S8 bookstore, about the dissident artist Ai Weiwei, pictured here, slagging off Tiananmen Square. It was a talk delivered by a professor from Hong Kong University. And so, you know, more than Han Han's account, which basically recapitulated a conventional story about Taiwan as a pure part of China, this art student's account could be spun as an example of the CCP's worst nightmare, as a sign that independent tourists would inevitably find their way into scenes and spaces that would subvert hegemonic narratives. But her tale is just one of many I recount in this chapter, which focuses as much on ambiguity and contradiction as on coherent, progressive stories of awakening or uncovering a hidden truth. For example, I interviewed many tourists, travelers, at Songshan Airport who came from wherever in China to visit their family members. They had a niece or a daughter or someone that married into Taiwan, and they were just here to check out, just to catch up with the family. They really had no interest or concern about political issues. To them, it was just a place to eat. So I interviewed dozens and dozens of tourists and described very, very different narratives on what they think Taiwan is, what China is, and how they should get along or not. So that concludes kind of the ethnographic and interview-focused part of the book, mostly, except to say Chapter 6 thinks through both the Taiwan Sunflower and Hong Kong Umbrella movements, which I also conducted ethnographies within, in terms of each other and through the lenses of tourism. It also follows the collapse of Ma's program after that, the election and re-election of President Tsai Ing-wen, the PRC's retaliatory cuts to tourism and its impacts here, and the consolidation of popular support for self-determination in Taiwan. I quote, for example, in this chapter, Sunflower spokesperson Li Feifan in an article in Foreign Policy that was titled, "Today's Hong Kong, Today's Taiwan." Quote, "The huge influx of mainland tourists, as well as mainlanders who became Hong Kong residents, created even more social problems. Taiwan faces similar concerns." I narrate the DPP's landslide win in 2016, President Tsai's disavowal of the 92 consensus, and announcement of the New Southbound policy, which was in part designed to bring in tourists from other places besides China, like Southeast Asia, and how China retaliated, and not unexpectedly, by cutting tourism, which led to something extraordinary, and yet another ethnographic opportunity. I don't know if anyone was here for this or remembers it, but in September 2016, over 10,000 tourism workers took to the streets of Taipei for a first ever industry protest. The event was organized and publicized by a variety of industry groups, including the Tourism Industry Self-Help Association, the Mainland Tourist Bus Drivers Alliance, and even the Taiwan Beef Noodle Soup Association. I joined them for the walk. Here's me, what is it? Yeah, the tourism industry saving itself. Here's my hat, so I'm very much a character. And behind me, I don't think you can read it, but it says something like, 欢迎大陆, something like Taiwan. Basically, welcome mainland guests to Taiwan. So I joined them for a walk from Huashan, Yiwen Techu, to all the way to Kaidao, the presidential office front. They had all kinds of interesting banners. Support the 92 consensus, save our country, 两岸一家亲, the two sides belong to the same family. And every single protester I talked to, including guides, drivers, and office staff, insisted their primary goal was to press Tsai to accept the One China principle and the 92 consensus in order to rescue their industry. The protest was extensively covered in China. There's a ton of it, be it everything from Global Times to much smaller publications. And despite all this noise, the industry's position began and remained firmly in the national minority. While China's cuts certainly hurt the livelihood of Taiwanese tour guides and drivers and imperiled the many hastily constructed hotels that mushroomed during the Ma-era tourism boom, the majority of Taiwan's economy was not reliant on tourism. That this cross-strait media storm occurred despite tourism's relatively small contribution to Taiwan's economic growth underscored its uncanny political salience. And in the meantime, the drops emboldened online activists and designers to unleash a flurry of satirical ads that celebrated the disappearance of Chinese tourists. "Welcome to Taiwan without Chinese," read the captions on a series of photos of idyllic, people-free landscapes, first released on the PTT online bulletin board system. PTT started here in Taiwan, right? As inbound tourism continued dropping, a team of 8 mayors from the KMT's Pan-Blue Coalition soon went to China on a self-help relief mission. They reached agreements with Chinese officials and tour companies to market trips only to counties and cities that elected KMT-aligned politicians who had avowed support for the '92 consensus. Dividing Taiwan into a strange half-donut shape, the '92 consensus tour. These so-called blue tours didn't find much of a market, at least according to the agents I spoke with, but their very existence indicated that tourism did for a time produce two Taiwans and yet another sense. Still, with Tsai's landslide re-election in 2020, it looked as if the more plural or at least popularly elected of the two Taiwans had eclipsed the other in the face of the red sun across the strait. But a few weeks later, in the cross-strait diplomatic and economic gray zone between open hostility and peaceful friction, the region and the wider world were rocked by a new viral force. Not a local border-perforating catastrophe like a bus crash, but the global border-reinforcing cataclysm of the COVID pandemic, which brought all cross-strait traffic to a standstill and thrust Chinese tourism and Taiwan's contested sovereignty to the center of world attention. And so the epilogue to this book describes that episode, and it goes on to conclude that as much as tourism served to signify China's global integration, its conduct remained constrained by the geopolitical imperatives of its governing party state. That tourism did not achieve political unification with Taiwan and in fact provoked a backlash illuminates the limits and contradictions between tourism's intertwined instrumentalities for capital accumulation and territorialization. The COVID pandemic not only effectively ended cross-strait tourism, but also put all of global tourism on an indefinite hiatus. Although Taiwan came out relatively unscathed, it is in as geopolitically precarious a position as ever. To conclude, One China, Many Taiwans shows how cross-strait tourism performed the territory of Taiwan in multiple and complex ways. Not only did these performances often transform guests and hosts' understanding of themselves and each other, they also played a part in transforming the territoriality of Taiwan and One China. Taiwan was a place where a blogger like Han Han could conceive a Chinese nationalist critique of the Chinese Communist Party, where a Shanghai-based student could discover dissidents at the Estate bookstore, or someone like myself could climb a ladder into the legislative occupation that became the Sunflower Movement, and where the exiled Hong Kong Causeway bookseller, Lam Wing-Ki, could open a new bookstore free from censorship and fear of kidnapping. Like its world-leading public health governance, Taiwan's spaces for realizing new ways of being in the world are produced in part by its precarity, its contested politics, and its sense of in-betweenness. The same could be said for Hong Kong. In this respect, the fates of the two territories have converged, even if the prescription designed for both, one country, two systems, diverged, if not collapsed completely. How to secure the means of reproduction for such alternative ways of being remains a crucial and challenging question for both territories, each in its own way. But still, this is a concern that Taiwan for now appears more safely placed to address. As Nina Casperson observed in a study of unrecognized states, non-recognition does not determine the political system, but it does constrain it. In some way, constraint's not such a bad thing. Its pressures can be productive, as shown by Taiwan's creative adaptations. The crisis of derecognition from the UN and the United States did help to push a largely bloodless transition to multi-party electoral democracy in the 80s. And such pressure has also propelled succeeding social movements, including the Sunflower Movement and transitional justice projects. Independence will solve everything, a slogan I spotted on a t-shirt worn by a Taiwan Independence Revolutionary Army demonstrator at Taipei 101, exemplifies a potent sentiment in Taiwan that might be considered a case of cruel optimism. This phrase has been memorably figured by Lauren Berlant as, quote, the condition of maintaining an attachment to a significantly problematic object. In Berlant's telling, attachments to dreams of wealth, beauty, freedom, and so on undermine their realization, obviating humbler effects at collective action that might realize a provisional good life. In the case of the demonstrator's slogan, the attachment is to a notion of state sovereignty that is manifestly unable to resolve transboundary governance problems, let alone threats of violent annexation. Like activists, tourists are no strangers to the sentiment of cruel optimism, as illustrated by another cliche the tour guide said. I'd always regret,不去台湾是I'd always regret not going to Taiwan, but having gone to Taiwan is something to regret always. Is it like no, it's like 去这个去台湾不去台湾是一辈子的后悔，去台湾后悔一辈子 something like that. Yeah, he said that, another tourist said that. Tourists seek pleasure and the freedom of movement even when they're constrained and complicated and undermined by imperatives of an industry that moves them. The sort of utopian desire of tourism propels its heterotopic manifestations and contradictory outcomes. And these optimistic aspects of tourism are that much crueler when considered alongside the well-known paradox that, at least for destinations that run on the promise of pristineness, the more popular they become, the more they undermine their own conditions of reproduction. Taiwan is not the only place performed and transformed by tourism, nor the only destination experienced and produced multiply and contradictorily by guests, hosts, and everyone in between. In Taiwan and elsewhere, tourism's promise of the good life by way of endless economic expansion was shattered, perhaps permanently by the pandemic. And however the global tourism industry rebuilds, it faces further challenges from climate change, mass extinctions, and immiseration accelerated by many of its own practices. This is why I didn't get a job in a tourism department. Up until the pandemic, tourism was among the most celebrated drivers of the endless growth potential of late capitalist globalization. The threat to economic production and social reproduction caused by everyday tourism and its sudden cessation highlights the risks of an international order predicated on mobilities long taken for granted. These mobilities will need to be refashioned in a world in which tourism will continue to simultaneously serve and destabilize the interests of capital and territory. Its valences of geopolitical, environmental, and social insecurity ever more visible. Beyond Taiwan and China, as other regions form and reform, as flows of bodies and capitals refigure states and nations, and as rising tides and changing climates reshape borders between land and sea, tourism's capacities to perform and transform territory will re-articulate in destinations yet to be realized. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, thank you, Ian. Wonderful story. Okay, so right now we have some Q&A time. So we have two ways to collect your questions and comments because we have participants virtually online. So for those who participate virtually online, you can actually write your questions on your screen and we will show your question and comments here on the screen for Ian. Okay, so let's do this. I will pick up one question on site for the audience on site, and then maybe questions for those participating virtually online. So okay, right now. So first of all, people here, any questions, comments? Yes, please.
Thanks for the wonderful talk, Professor Rowen. And I wonder if in your ethnographic observation on the bus, I wonder what degree or how much are the audience on the Chinese tourists aware of this very skilled tailoring and catering in terms of language on the side on the part of the tour guide. Are these carefully catered and balanced language being challenged by the sort of target audience at all, or are they just follow suit and say, oh, this is fits our imagination and knowledge, pre-knowledge about Taiwan? And second thing is that is any during the itinerary institutional development such as the southern branch of Pugong, right, in Jiayi, that kind of institution obviously does not emphasize on the national treasure discourse. But is this kind of new institutional development put into the itinerary at all?
Yeah, thank you for two great questions. So the tourists, all of them had been on tours in China before, and they were aware that their interests and the interests of the tour guide weren't necessarily aligned. They were all aware, as was I, having been a tour director in China, that the tour guide was making most of his money on their shopping. He was getting a small amount of money just from being a tour guide, but most of it would be a commission, in many cases extremely high commissions, for buying junk. And some very interesting junk. I mentioned the KMT bases. We also went to a tea store in Alishan where Ma Yingjiu, I should have put this on the slide, Ma Yingjiu's photo was actually the cover of the tea box. So they're aware that the tour guide doesn't necessarily have their best interests at heart. At the same time, they did express gratitude for the ease of the tour. You know, they don't have to think. They don't even have to look at the itinerary. I had a copy I kept looking at. I was the only one looking at the itinerary. The rest of the guests were happy to 上车睡觉下车尿尿, right? They're happy to come and go, and they appreciated that care. I think they were also not particularly concerned about the political implication. I think if anything, the guide's performance was successful. They did ask him questions like, they asked like, what's up with Li Donghui, former President Li Donghui? He's really Japanese, isn't he? And the guy would answer according to ways he expected them to want to hear, and more or less they were satisfied with that. They did occasionally find the tour guide, they found some of his plays on accents a little bit forced, a little bit contrived. Like he said "nar," like in this very kind of almost like even more northerny way than the guests who were not from the north. They were from Jiangsu or from Shanghai, and they found that a little bit 做作的, a little bit effective. So that that was interesting to watch that dance. Your second question, did we go to these sorts of more, I guess, Taiwan branded sites? No. We went to Pugong to learn about what the guide referred to as 5,000 years of Chinese treasures. When I went to, even not on that tour bus, like when I was doing preliminary work at Sunling Lake, and it was very, very hard to enter souvenir stores at Sunling Lake, even as early as 2012, as an independent tourist, to do the observation. I heard the salespeople, often dressed up in indigenous costumes. I'm not sure if they were indigenous or wearing costumes, but this is very common in China. You go to Yunnan and you'll see Han people dressed up as Baizu or whatever else, talking about Alishan or some of the lake products as Taiwan Guobao. This is a little bit problematic for a lot of more nationalist guests, but they were able to overlook a bit of that. But I think to put something like the southern branch of Pugong, or a very explicitly Taiwan, culturally or nationally Taiwan, but for example, anything I think as universities, even to call Taida Guoli, can spike an international collaboration. And I think something like that would spike that destination for mass tourism. As an addendum to that, places that are actually important for Taiwanese nationalists for very different reasons. For example, 228 memorials were not on our itinerary at all. And the way the guide explained that to me when I asked him for example, we walked in Kaohsiung, we walked to the Love River, and we walked around what would have been the 228 memorial there. And I'm like, why don't we at least walk through it and you can mention this history? He said, no, I don't want to talk about it because it was their people that did that. that did their people, meaning mainlanders, although very different sorts of mainlanders, that implemented that state violence on Taiwan. So that was his explanation to me, at least. And so most of the guests came away from Taiwan having no understanding of that history. If anything, the guy did play a lot of stuff about Chiang Kai-shek, but in a way that celebrated national affinity rather than legacies of violence in Taiwan.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. So now let's take turns. So for people online, there's a question here. What is your take on this perception of discourse of Taiwan by PRC tourists? If when tourism will be resumed again eventually, so it's like something in the future. Your opinion?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how to answer this question. I don't see tourism resuming in the way it had. It's hard to imagine under the current political climate between China and Taiwan that we will have millions and millions of group tourists coming here and going in such a similar circuit. It's hard enough for independent tourists to enter as well, and that's due at this point actually to decisions on both sides. So I don't know. I mean, I will say, and this is something that Chapter 6 covers in great detail, that the promise of bringing more tourists in has been at stake in elections. Han Guoyu, the then mayor of Kaohsiung, who was running for president, spoke that when he was elected, Chinese tourism would again pop up and everyone would get rich. It's hard to imagine a similar candidate emerging by 2024. So I can't really say. Hopefully both sides by then understand each other a little bit better and can have smoother interactions. It's a shame that those are completely cut off.
Yeah. Okay. So right now, okay.
Thank you so much. My name is Archer from Philly, Pennsylvania, and I'm an ethnic Taiwanese studying at NTU. So yeah, I do appreciate your talk, and you mentioned something about like self-censorship, so it reminds me of some of the Chinese students and also the Chinese tourists here in Taiwan. And a lot of times they actually told me that before coming here, actually the state apparatus will gather them together and tell them what to do. Like some events you shouldn't go to, and some of them, furthermore, they actually have agendas, they have to report on certain people or something like that. Not just in Taiwan, but in other parts of the world, like in the States as well. And so some scholars call it, the silent invasion or sharp power or espionage or spies, trying to manipulate the Taiwan or the States or Australia, using the overseas Chinese diaspora. So I think you probably don't take that into account in this book, but what is your take on this issue, and how do you think that's kind of transforming the the territorial dispute or political agenda? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I'll answer this also from the perspective of a student. When I was a graduate student researching this book at CU Boulder, I would go to keep up my Mandarin and to make new friends and so on, and also to keep an eye on what's going on in terms of international influence operations. I went to meetings of the China Student and Scholars Association, which is, most of the participants in that are perfectly nice graduate students or scholars getting together, but it is funded by the CCP. It does have a relationship with the embassies, and they are keeping an eye in a way that actually a lot of KMT supported or affiliated scholars and students, including one of the quite powerful presidents even, were doing in the US as well, years ago, decades ago. So I joined this, I went to meetings like this, and I was invited to serve as an MC for the annual Spring Festival event, where the Texas consulate, the Houston consulate, said to dragon and Mayan dancers and stuff. And so I was on stage as one of 3 or 4 MCs doing mixed Mandarin English MCing. And they had troops that they sent, dance troops, including a dance troupe that was ostensibly Taiwanese indigenous Gaoshanzhu, and then ostensibly Miaozhu from China, a different ethnic group. And I refused to announce the Taiwan Gaoshanzhu. I'm like, I can do this other stuff, but I'm not going to announce Taiwan Gaoshanzhu. That's ludicrous. And then they met the person that did announce the Taiwan Gaoshan actually mixed them up with the Miaozu. And I mentioned this to the head of the association, who said to me, "Oh, it doesn't matter. All minority groups are the same anyway." I mean, that's a somewhat elliptical way of saying, like, there are many students and many tourists who are just trying to enjoy their lives and do their thing. I met so many perfectly nice, sweet people in Taiwan having very meaningful experiences that I relate, especially in chapter 5. People who came to Taiwan who wanted to just enjoy the minsu, the bed and breakfast. People who came to Taiwan because they found it xiao qingxin, they found it kind of cute and fresh and sweet. They come here, they treat it kind of like a lot of Americans treat Hawaii or something. They saw it in this way. But then I met others who had very different ideas and different agendas. And so I'm a little bit, I think, especially given our rise of anti-Asian American sentiment and violence that has swept a lot of the US, I'm very wary of language like silence invasion. Even if Clive Hamilton, the Australian who wrote that book, is writing under kind of a different premise. At the same time, it's very, very hard to evaluate a lot of claims of security threats. People just won't tell you stuff if that's the case. But I'd say for the vast majority of tourists and students, they're tourists and students. But we often all wear different hats. I had an agenda when I was doing this research too, to switch out hats. So it's hard for me to give a very straightforward answer to that very interesting and important question.
Yeah. Okay, we have another one from the online side. So some tourist hotspots with material characteristics, okay, like Green Island, Kinmen Islands, remain anti-communist slogans like Gong Fu or something like that, I guess. In your observations, how will people from mainland China react to these slogans?
A lot of them found that kind of kitschy. I wish I did more research in Diman. This is actually a gap in the book. I didn't do much research in Diman primarily because group tours almost never go there. They're doing circling of Taiwan. I was really focused on Taiwan as a discursive object, you could say. But the Cold War stuff was definitely appealing for a lot of them. They found it somewhat amusing. Some of them sympathized with it, and especially if it was still from a Chinese nationalist, not a Taiwanese nationalist point of view. Chinese nationalist slogans were still appealing to some, and there is kind of, there's a whole book on this, on Hanfu, by Kevin Carrico, about kind of an anachronistic, nostalgic subculture that's popped up in China. It's into ROC, or early Republican Chinese cultural practices, and in this case, places like Diman were appealing. I don't think all that many Chinese tourists went to Green Island. Independent ones really more for snorkeling, and not so much for the Human Rights Memorial for the prisoner.
Yeah. Okay. How about people from this group? Yes.
Thank you so much. The book sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading it later when we actually have the copies.
Well, you can get it online.
Okay. I think the book title is quite clever, One China, Many Taiwans. But from listening to your talk, we also know that there is more than one China, right? The Chinese tourist group are a heterogeneous group.
Yeah.
And you briefly mentioned the difference between a group tourist and independent tourists. So I want to hear more about, can we identify some social factor to see their different expectation in terms of tourism in Taiwan? Because I would imagine, people from the city, people, more wealthy Chinese tourists, or younger generation, they will have very different expectation. They even look down on the group tourists. They are seeing this fake Taiwan. We are trying to see the authentic, real Taiwan, whatever it actually connotes. So I'm just wondering, can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks. I trust the sociologist asked a very structural question. Absolutely, differences between group and independent tourists, and also difference between those two groups over time. So Taiwan isn't unique in that pretty much every country China sends tourists to, at the beginning they'll start only by opening it up to first-tier cities. So the tourists have to come from Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou to start, and then even group tourists. And this is partly to, I suppose, keep what they assume are going to be the wealthier and perhaps better educated, better behaved, maybe, or more civilized, more friendly sorts of tourists coming before gradually opening up to second and third tier cities. And that was something that was on the China side, not on the Taiwan side. So they start with group tourists from those cities and expand into more, and then independent tourists also open up from those cities and expand into more. I didn't find, I think your suggestion that independent tourists, some of them would look down on group tourists, it's not wrong. You know, and this is also not unique to Chinese tourists. You know, we find tourists everywhere, like, I'm not a tourist, I'm a traveler. So there was some of that. Also, Chinese group tourists, different groups. I think my group was really very typical. I don't say like the composition of them or the location, but the way the tour was managed was pretty common throughout most of the groups. I think they weren't so interested also in the real Taiwan. And a lot of the independent tourists also didn't really care. They don't, I think in this way actually Chinese tourists are more sophisticated than most Euro-American tourists who are still obsessed with the authentic, finding the real. And Chinese tourists are in some ways much more postmodern. You know, they're like, let's have a good time, let's have some food. Like, yeah, a lot of this is surfaces, a lot of this is shopping, a lot of this is nonsense. It's okay though. You know, we're having fun. Except they had really bad food, especially on their tours. To clarify a bit about the title, the One China is not, it's not implying that tourists are homogenous. It's playing with the One China principle and the One China policy, right? That's what it's getting at. And the many Taiwans, it gets at the many Taiwans that are produced, but also that there's as many Taiwans as there are eyes to see them through, be that of tourists or of residents. So it's playing with that a bit. To say more, I would suggest, reading the book, and I'd love to talk later about some of these structural issues. Something I wasn't able to do, because I'm primarily doing ethnography, is do more systematic survey work or look at, for example, different economic or educational factors. But even then, almost every attempt I've seen to do that has been pretty shabby. Almost all of the quantitative work I've seen on Chinese tourism in Taiwan has been based on things like tourist self-reporting of their income or their spending or so on, and I find that incredibly unreliable. I find even the Taiwan immigration statistics about numbers of independent versus group tourists or purpose of visit also not reliable in any way. I was often in line with Chinese tourists who were clearly in groups but put down that they were independent tourists on their applications because by then China had already started cutting down group tourism. So it's really hard to give, I think, an answer that would satisfy a sociologist. But I simply say yes, group and independent tourists behave in radically different ways and often have very different senses of Taiwan. Yeah.
Okay. How about people online? Any more questions from the online side? No? If we don't have any questions, maybe, yes.
Thanks for your presentation. I have a question about independent travelers. How do they choose where to go in Taiwan? Do they go online or do they buy some guidebook to decide where they are going to go? Because if there are some guidebook about Taiwan, I think it can influence how they perceive the territory versus the China.
Yeah, that's a great question. I spent some time analyzing guidebooks and also analyzing tourism websites. And in speaking to them, they seem to use both. A lot of them would just go on C-Trip, and look for like a cheap minsu, a cheap B&B, and based on that, they would book somewhere in, I don't know, Yuan or Hualien or something. Others had fixed ideas. You know, they had places they really wanted to go, Sunwin Lake or night markets. Others had friends or contacts, or they were into Taiwanese music or something. They wanted to go to the witch's house, not far from here. So they really used a mix of things. And I would say And that also gets to the question of some structural factors are different about generations. You know, the younger ones tend to be a bit more online. Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? Maybe online and people from this side? Any questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for your book talk. Thank you for your book talk. I look forward to reading the Economic academic book. And it's so different from the Taiwan tourist. And may you give some example how to compare with the traveler and tourists, and have you read their travel writing, and how can you compare with different perspective?
Sorry,
Even you have the different compare with the traveler and the tourist. Even you focus on the traveler, you focus on the tourist, but some of the people they say we are not tourists. So how can you compare with them?
Yeah, I don't treat the traveler-tourist distinction as anything real. I think it says as much about the speaker and their sense of distinction, you could say, as it does about anything. I think I've spoken to some Chinese travelers or tourists in far out places. Like I've met them, I don't know, Myanmar, which is not far from China. Or India or something, and people who identify, I suppose, as more hardened travelers. I don't know. I don't treat traveler and tourist as analytically distinct, and the book doesn't either. Yeah.
Probably we have maybe 1 to 2 questions. Okay.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm an exchange student from Australia, and I was wondering how the media affected the tourism numbers and like the discourse in the media about war or something like that.
Yeah. So, and we're speaking here of the Taiwanese media or the Chinese media or both.
Both.
Yeah. So the Taiwanese media. It went in a few directions. I mean, it would talk about large numbers of tourists in some places. There were complaints about defaced areas, plants that had been carved into in Taidong, or a mess being made in Kanding. This happened a lot in Hong Kong as well, and some of the rhetoric started verging on, you could call it racist. But again, to call it racist is very interesting. The rhetoric would be the kind of rhetoric you might hear in like Australia or US kind of racist. But for me to call it that also brings up the question of ethno-national fellowship that is purportedly shared or not between Taiwanese and Chinese. But the media will sometimes amplify that kind of thing. But on the whole, there was a lot of talk about people coming and potential money to be made. On the China side, there was a lot of reports about, yay, Taiwan is open, everyone can go there and enjoy food and stuff. Yay, Taiwan is more Chinese than ever. And then, of course, the media really amplified during the protests, the small protests, really, all things considered, against Tsai from the tourism industry. The media there did their best to talk about how much Taiwan was suffering because of tourism cuts that they, at first, were a bit cagey about blaming on Tsai, but later were much more explicit about. So a lot of interviews with taxi drivers who didn't have guests anymore, or empty hoteliers or the like. So the media played a role in that respect. Yeah.
All right, I guess I can take one more. Last question? One more? Okay, sure.
Not necessarily a question, but first sharing my own experiences. I've been working on a project in Hualien for the past year, which is the reason why I couldn't meet you. So I happen to have multiple experiences settling down into a B&B in Su, rooms full of messages in simplified Chinese. So obviously, the particular Nimsu I was in was only accommodating managers before the pandemic. And it seems that the owner doesn't necessarily want to change at all. He has been waiting, and maybe soon we will be opening up. So it just felt very bizarre staying. So for Taiwanese to stay in a space like this in Taiwan. And I assume there might be much more legacy of that particular tourism boom during specific periods. The second comment that I want to share is that it seems that to some Chinese, there's a particular appeal of religious tourism in Taiwan. So I've met a lady in her 50s. This was like 4 years ago. I was doing research in Shanghai. And she's very excited, telling me that, I'm going to Taiwan next month, and I'm going with my church. And I also heard that on an occasion, another woman told me that she can't wait to visit Womangshan in Kaohsiung. Yeah, so I wonder if you have any plan to further advance your research. So by extension, maybe your next step. Yeah.
Okay. I'll try to be brief. So Foguangshan and Zhongtaishan were places the group tourists visited, even though they professed no affinity for Buddhism. And those were places that really played up China-Taiwan connections and have all kinds of interesting politics on their own. Frankly, I'm a bit sick of this project. I don't know if I'm going to continue flogging the book, because I think it's a good book, but I don't know if I want to spend any more years of my life hanging out with tourists in this way. So we'll see. Yeah, but I think perhaps touring the ruins as you did, staying in the ruins and talking to Taiwanese people that have been affected and have to reorient could be somewhat interesting. Finally, I want to ask, we can end soon, but your suggestions, and we can talk later about this, for the Chinese language title of this book. I'm happy to announce that the book will be out with Zuo'an, a great publisher in a Chinese language version, hopefully in time to sell well for the next presidential election, which of course will have cross-strait issues. So the title, the current working title is 一中多表, playing with the 一中各表notion of the 92 consensus, but I don't know how.
Where's Taiwan?
Right, initially I'm thinking 一中多台. But I don't know if that makes sense either to people. So if anyone has any clever ideas, I'm really happy to share those with the publisher who may still be listening right now.
Sure. One last simple question, from myself. So what was the favorite destination and the place they hated, of the Chinese tourists in Taiwan from your observation?
So they were really, my group tourists were finally, they kept complaining about how shabby everywhere we went was. Like Taipei does not look as modern as Hangzhou. Even Sun Moon Lake has nothing on West Lake. Alishan has nothing on Huangshan. But they were actually impressed, to get back to Shumei, they were actually impressed by Foguangshan. They found it very 壮观, like really somehow majestic. I don't know if they were impressed by the ATMs at the entrance or the really high-end brands at this very pious Buddhist conglomerate. But they found that 壮观. Taipei 101 Mall, maybe you can compare to what they're used to in Shanghai. What they didn't like, I suppose it was eating at this unmarked basement restaurant in Sun Moon Lake. Really the food was astonishing, and they were confused by why they had heard so much good stuff about Taiwan food. But we can blame the group tour operator for this. They did like the night markets.
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's give applause to Ian for this wonderful conversation with us, and go get a copy of his book if you can. Okay, and thank you for your presentation and the event for today. So if you would like to join the mailing list of the Global Asia Center, please do, because we have wonderful events in the future. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Ian. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, 当然了。Thank you. Wonderful. So you don't have your copy? Oh no. And for the Chinese title,